Hey everybody, this is Josh. Welcome to Beers with an Economist. Today we're going to be talking about inflation, the thing that all of my friends and family have been asking about lately, and you've probably been hearing all over the news. So what is inflation? What's causing it? And is there anything we can do about it? That's what we're going to talk about today over beers. What is inflation? Inflation is when the average price level of the economy is rising together. Currently, the reason everybody is worried is because inflation last year was about 7.5%. And currently in January, those numbers, when we annualize them, means that inflation hasn't really slowed down. It's still about 7.45%. So what does that mean for the average consumer? Well, to put it in perspective, one, inflation averaged about 1.5% in the decade from 2011 to 2020. So these are very big numbers compared to what most consumers are used to. The second thing is, a great way to think about this is that if you are saving about 10% of your salary, that means that about 2/3 of it evaporated last year. 2/3 of those savings just gone because the money's not worth as much as it was when you started. All right, so what everybody wants to know at this point is what's causing the inflation and how to fix it. We'll get to how to fix it in just a minute. But first of all, what's causing the inflation? You've probably heard a lot in the news, various people giving their opinions on, well, maybe it's transitory just due to the supply chain issues. And maybe it's due to corporations just being greedy, looking for an opportunity to raise prices. But I'm here to tell you that it's probably neither of those things, at least not to any large extent. The main cause of inflation is the same cause of inflation that we've always had. You're about to run into something, I'm sorry. But those are probably not the main causes of inflation. The real cause of inflation is the same thing that's been causing inflation throughout the history of money, and that is a growth in the money supply. Okay? So, what do I mean by that? Well, our central bank, the Federal Reserve, controls how much money is available in our economy. And this essentially is a representation of how much of our wealth that we have in a liquid asset that can be easily spent. Now, why do they change the amount of money available in the economy? Well, you would do that for various reasons. So number one, you want your money supply to grow a little bit over time to account for economic growth, so people have more money to spend on the new production. But additionally, and the main reason the Fed tampers with the money supply is to deal with economic downturns, right? So what we had happen in 2020 with COVID was an economic catastrophe in the making. So if you'll recall, unemployment in April and May hit 14.7%. And because of some technicalities in the way that we measure unemployment, the real number was probably closer to 18%. Those are astronomically bad numbers. This is like Great Depression level unemployment. It is unprecedented in modern economic era. So everybody needed to act fast, right? How are we gonna save the economy? How are we gonna keep everything from tanking? So our central bank, the Federal Reserve, decided to start expanding the money supply. Now, what does this do? They start taking market actions to increase the amount of money available to people in the economy, to banks, to consumers, and that encourages new spending that wasn't possible before, and hopefully gives the economy a boost. Now, this is typically a slow process. To put that in perspective, oftentimes we think of Federal Reserve action taking a few months to play out, maybe 6 months, maybe even up to a year to really have a solid effect. This was not the case this time, right? Within a few months, we had increased the money supply dramatically. And right now, our M2, which is a measure of the money supply, is up by nearly 50%, right? So that's 1.5 times more money than we had before. Okay, now why does that cause inflation? Well, if you think about it, once the economy is not in dire straits anymore, if everybody has more money to spend, but no additional goods and services to spend it on, then everybody's spending more money on the same number of goods, which means that everything is going to get more expensive because people are bidding up the prices with all this additional money. Federal Reserve increasing the money supply actually got into the pockets of consumers very quickly this time, far quicker than we're used to seeing. And the reason for that is coordination with the federal government and the recovery payments and the multi-trillion dollars of stimulus bills that were passed in 2020. Now, essentially what that is instead of kind of filtering money through the banking system, which is how they typically do it, the Fed just bought the debt that was created when Congress passed those several multi-trillion dollar stimulus bills. Now that money, a good chunk of it got mailed directly to the consumers. So this is the equivalent of just kind of dropping a huge amount of money into the consumers' pockets directly from the Federal Reserve. And that action was enormously effective at saving the economy, right? So we went from an unemployment rate that was effectively almost 15%, probably closer to 18% reality, to right now, current unemployment as of January is about 3.9%, which is just a touch higher than it was when the pandemic started. So that's an important point to remember. What about alternative explanations for inflation? So for example, the Biden administration spent a lot of effort trying to convince the public that this inflation was transitory, meaning that they felt like that restrictions in the supply chain due to COVID issues, among many other things, were the sole thing responsible for causing the inflation. Now, there's a couple reasons why that's probably not true. One is that the goods and services affected by those supply chain issues aren't broad enough to really cause widespread inflation long term, right? Like what we're seeing right now. Two, a lot of those supply chain issues have gone away as the year has gone on, right? So since 2020, we have had far fewer supply chain issues, and yet the inflation has only accelerated since then. So this leads me to believe that these supply chain issues are not playing a huge role in the overall price increase, although they certainly are playing a major role in certain sectors, right? So for example, used cars are up by nearly 40%. That is a direct result of the semiconductor chip shortage that we've been experiencing, and it's been causing a shortage of new cars, and therefore their substitute good, used cars, has gone up in price, right? But it has very little to do with things like groceries getting more expensive and overall prices going up. The other thing you've been hearing is that maybe these price increases are due to corporate greed, right? So we've got a lot of greedy corporations that are just taking advantage of the change in the public's perceptions of what's happening and what's going on, and they're raising prices on us because, you know, we're not going to hold it against them right now, something like that, right? Now, while I don't want to dismiss this outright, that companies are able to raise prices right now, maybe more so than they could have before, one thing that you have to consider is if companies could just raise prices on consumers without it affecting their bottom line, why haven't they always been raising prices to pad up their bottom line? And that right there should give you pause, right? Now, the second thing about this is that there's a bit of nuance here in that firms that have a degree of monopoly power, that is, they're large corporations that have very little competition, do have a little bit more wiggle room with pricing as it affects their profits than, say, a more competitive company in a market with a lot of different companies competing with them, right? But even then, how much could this possibly be affecting the overall price level? I don't see it being a major player. Could some corporations be taking advantage of the moment to raise prices even though their costs haven't gone up? That's possible, but it's probably not playing a big role in what we're seeing right now. The real story is that we're in an inflationary environment because the money supply was increased by a dramatic degree. And this has been the major cause of inflation throughout the history of societies and money. All right, folks, we've made it to the brewery and I've got my beer. So let's talk a little bit about inflation in terms of historical precedent. So a lot of people are asking me, are we back to the 1970s? Is this the Great Inflation all over again? So for those of you who don't know, the Great Inflation refers to a period of time in the late 60s through the early 1980s in which inflation hit extraordinarily high levels, double-digit levels, peaking out at about 14% sometime in the early 80s. Now, one of the primary causes of the Great Inflation of the 70s was a tremendous growth in the money supply, just like right now. But we have a few advantages on our side too. So back in the 1970s, macroeconomists didn't have a really good understanding of how monetary policy worked, right? They didn't quite understand the impact of that monetary growth could accumulate over time to create that level of inflation. Okay? In addition to that, there was a lot of uncertainty and volatility about what happens with the money supply coming off the gold standard in 1971. And then we also had a series of oil crises in 1973 and in the late 1970s. So there was a lot of bad things happening in the 1970s economy that made it very difficult for the Federal Reserve to get inflation under control. So in the early 1980s, Paul Volcker, who was the Fed chairman at the time, did what, and I'm paraphrasing here, hitting the economy over the head with a sledgehammer, right? And this meant that he dramatically cut the money supply and took a lot of other very drastic measures to raise interest rates in order to get inflation under control. Now, this worked, and it goes to show you that sometimes Fed chairmen have to do dramatic things in order to get the economy back under control. A lot like Jerome Powell had to make very drastic changes to the money supply in order to get us out of the impending recession that we had due to COVID. Now, Paul Volcker's decision didn't come without consequence, though. When he cut the money supply that dramatically and worked so hard to raise rates, this actually caused a pretty severe recession in the early to mid 80s, and the economy improved after that, and we saw very moderate inflation levels from then on, right? So in the subsequent years, we saw 3.5% inflation, which quickly cooled down to 2% inflation, and throughout most of the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, we've seen very moderate levels of inflation, okay? So what can we do to stop the current inflation? That's another thing that a lot of people have been very concerned about. And the thing is, we learned a lot from Paul Volcker and his decision to hit the economy over the head with a sledgehammer. Number one, the Fed knows how to control inflation. All they have to do is reduce the money supply and take other measures to raise interest rates in order to cool the economy down and reduce the price level increase. There's one problem with that, though. The other thing that we learned from Paul Volcker is if we do that too quickly, the economy suffers. And by suffer, I need you to understand that at the peak of the recession that Volcker caused by hitting the economy over the head with the sledgehammer, unemployment hit 11%. So we don't want that to happen again, right? So what Jerome Powell and the Fed have to balance is the need to get inflation under control and not doing it so quickly as to cause a massive recession like the one Volcker caused in the 80s. So what we have to do is draw the money supply back down gradually over the course of several months to possibly even several years. And their decision on how quickly to do that will be determined by how the economy responds as they gradually start this process of drawing the money supply down. Now, what does that mean for the average consumer? Well, it means that, at least for the time being, you're going to be living with higher prices. Prices are going to continue to increase at a moderate pace through the end of the year at least, possibly even longer, okay? So what can the average consumer do here? The problem is the average consumer cannot do very much about this because by its very nature, inflation affects almost every good and service that we buy. So what is my advice to all of my friends and family and all of you watching at home? Well, it's time to get really good at negotiating with your boss. Americans used to be very used to asking for what's called a cost of living adjustment, or a COLA. It's time that Americans learned how to do that again. Sometime this year, you need to think about how you're going to negotiate with your boss to get a modest pay raise, because right now you're earning less than you were last year. Even though you're getting paid the same, your dollars buy fewer things than they did before, so you're actually making less than you were. And that's a great way to phrase this when you're talking to your boss about this, is that I'm actually have taken a pay cut over the last year without getting a pay raise because of inflation. The unfortunate reality for all of us is that in order to save ourselves from what could have been the worst recession since the Great Depression, we had to take drastic measures. And a consequence of those drastic measures, possibly overshooting those drastic measures a little bit, means that we're going to be dealing with inflation north of 5%, probably through 2023.